Hey, hello, and hi! Katia here. I hope you and yours are doing very well. So, today we're going to talk about how leftist ideas can and perhaps even should correlate with polytheist values. Today, we're mainly going to be focusing on heathenry as far as the polytheistic aspect of that goes, and anarchism as far as the leftist aspect of that goes. That is not to say by any means that heathenry is the only polytheist tradition that we can have this conversation about. There's a reason, for instance, why so many anarchists cite Zeno of Citium, for instance, as he had views so radical that they would make even the likes of Frederick Engels blush. But for more information on Stoicism, I actually recommend checking out my friend Aliakai's channel. Today, we're going to be focusing on heathenry. And I know this topic for many is probably a bit controversial, but as someone kind of trying to be a bridge between BreadTube and what I call BroomTube or Polytheist YouTube, I thought that this would be a good topic for me to delve into, especially given that so many of my audience members are pagan or leftists. Actually, this might be kind of fun. Tell me in the comments, are you pagan and leftist and not pagan, or pagan but not leftist? Just to kind of see who all I'm talking with. Might be kind of fun to engage with y'all. So, little caveat, I am not saying you have to be socialist to be heathen, but I am saying that there are interesting points where heathenry and anarchism overlap. One of the primary principles of heathenry is reciprocity, and while you don't have to use the have 'em all to be heathen, I find the explanation in the have 'em all, stanzas 41 through 44, to be quite helpful in explaining this concept. So I'll put them on the screen here, and it reads, "Friends should provide their friends with weapons and clothing. This kind of generosity shows. Generous mutual giving is the key to lifelong friendship. Be a friend to your friend and repay each gift with a gift. Repay laughter with laughter. Repay treachery with treachery. Be a friend to your friend and also to his friend, but never be a friend to the enemy of your friend. If you have a good friend and really trust him and want good to come of your friendship, you should speak your mind with him, exchange gifts, visit him often." And I know that there was the use of him in that particular translation. It's the Crawford translation, whereas I could see some of us maybe preferring they there to be more inclusive. But keep in mind, the talker, the person speaking that passage, is gender fluid himself, so I feel like we can cut the Allfather some slack. So explained a little bit more succinctly, let's say I give you a gift, then you would become indebted to me until you give me a gift, but you don't necessarily want to stop there because that would end the cycle of reciprocity. So you would want to give me a gift that would flip it so I become in debt to you, and then I would want to do the same in turn for as long as I want to be receiving gifts from you. Now, I should give the clarification and caveat, this is voluntary. If you no longer want to engage in the gifting cycle, then you are free to disengage. And I should mention as well, this applies not just to human relationships, but this is how heathens, generally speaking, interact with like the gods, ancestors, and other relevant spirits like the Vaitir or Veitir. And just a small note, I do use the term Vaitir rather than Wights, Wights, mainly because the term Wights is specifically an Anglo term or an English thing, and that conflation is actually a form of linguistic syncretism. The first use there was when William Morris translated Goethe's saga. He used the term Barrow-Wight, translating the term Hubui, which is a kind of drur, as such, and from there we now have a lot of people in English-speaking heathenry who use the term whites and Veitir or Vaitir interchangeably, and I'm not saying that's invalid if you happen to do that. If that's how you feel about it, that's fine, but just be aware that you are practicing a form of syncretism when you do that. But with that side note, that's the gifting cycle in a nutshell. I give to you, you give to me, I give to you, you give to me, until or unless one of us decides that we no longer want gifts from the other. And this is how relationships work with the gods too. Interesting to point out, in heathenry, there is no subservience to any deity, as your relationship with each god is meant to be reciprocal. Therefore, from a heathen perspective, you are, typically speaking, at least in every heathen that I have talked to about this, and my own understanding, no subservience whatsoever to any god. That doesn't really seem to be how it works. It's more of a reciprocal dynamic. And I feel like that's important from an anarchist perspective. And on that note, let's talk a bit about anarchism. So, like most socialist schools of thought, anarchism sees a distinction between personal possessions and private property, the latter of which anarchism does not condone. The difference being, personal possessions would be things like your home, your toothbrush, the fruits of your labor, land used for personal cultivation, whereas private property would be things like buildings used to extract rent from tenants, factories, surplus value extracted from the labor of others, and land used for the extracting of surplus value of wage laborers. Another distinction anarchists often make is that private property uses state-sanctioned violence, whereas personal possessions are determined through use and occupancy. This is especially true of mutualism, but most anarchists would agree. Anarchists also believe in what's called the labor theory of value, which is a theory of value that argues that the economic value of a good or service is determined by the total amount of socially necessary labor required to produce it. There's more than one version of the LTV, but that's the nuts and bolts of it and something anarchists generally agree on. The reason for all of this, the reason for these dynamics, is actually to ensure that all social dynamics are reciprocal. Reciprocity is extremely important in anarchism, as it is in heathenry. In fact, this is so much the case that the mutualist flag has two arrows, kind of looks like a recycling sign almost, but these arrows literally represent reciprocity, as mutualist theory is entirely based on social, political, and economic dynamics being reciprocal. For this reason, mutualist theory discourages any income that comes through rents, investments, or loans, and advocates for what's called mutual credit, in which creditors and debtors are the same people. And just a note, mutual credit is not a type of money, as no currency is actually issued. The purpose for all of this being to ensure reciprocity. Anarcho-communism, which agrees with mutualism on many points, there are some distinctions, but they're relatively compatible, actually takes this a step further in that, like mutualism has mutual credit, anarcho-communism advocates for mutual aid. And mutual aid, by the way, is a type of gift economy with neither money, markets, nor planning, and ANCOMs have this view specifically because they view this as what will end the cycle of poverty. So here we see, in anarchist schools of thought, reciprocity being a central tenet, and in the case of anarcho-communism, going so far as to literally advocate gifting as far as the economic principles go. Just to note, some of the differences between mutualism and anarcho-communism is mutualism may or may not be in favor of markets, but tends to view them as relatively temporary, whereas anarcho-communism is generally more hostile towards the idea of markets, and on top of that, anarcho-communism holds as a principle from each according to their abilities to each according to their needs. So that's kind of sort of the nuts and bolts of some of the differences, but they're relatively compatible. However, the point being, mutualism is entirely based on reciprocity, and anarcho-communist econ is based entirely on gifting. So not only can we see they're compatible with heathenry, but they have some of the same principles. So we can really see that when you compare heathenry towards anarchism, you can see that heathenry is a quite progressive religion in many respects, which, I guess shouldn't be that big of a surprise given there are literally gender-fluid deities within the religion. But it kind of gets me wondering, so I am not making the claim here that Old Norse society was in any way, shape, or form progressive by any stretch of the imagination. Unfortunately, anyone making that claim is being ahistorical, as it was a caste system with thralls as slaves, carl as freemen, and jarl being chieftains, etc., and a bullion economy. However, it is interesting to note that despite this very, very reactionary conservatism, that Old Norse society was actually built from the bottom up. It was an agrarian society. Now, this is just speculation, but it's interesting to ponder that perhaps some of the reason for that could have been influenced due to the progressive nature of Germanic polytheism. I'm not making that claim, I'm just speculating, but it is very interesting to think about, as it is interesting to think that modern Scandinavian culture is now some of the most progressive culture that you can experience. Well, if you're white, obviously Scandinavia has some systemic racism issues that need to be worked out very thoroughly. But it is interesting to note that in a society in which, if you see a lot of Scandinavians, at least Danish people, practicing Jud, that heathenry is very ubiquitous in many ways, even among people that are in no way, shape, or form heathen, because it just kind of comes with the culture. And Jesus is not part of that whatsoever, so it makes me kind of wonder if part of the reason for the progressivism that Scandinavia has might be a remnant from the culture of Germanic polytheism to some extent or another. I'm sure that the rapid secularism had a lot to do with that too. Don't get me wrong, I'm not underselling that, I'm not blind to it. But it's just kind of interesting to think about. And yes, I know Scandinavia has a long way to go, but in terms of comparing it to other places in the world, I think most people would agree that it's relatively progressive compared to too many other places in the world. Though I suppose everything is relative. So I should clarify, I am not saying if you are not currently a socialist or an anarchist that you're not a heathen. That's not what I mean at all. But it is interesting how heathenry walks abreast to socialism and anarchism in so many ways. But no, as it stands, you don't need to be a socialist or an anarchist to be a heathen, any more than you need to be a heathen to be an anarchist. But isn't it interesting the values correlate so well? This is something we need to talk more about, and certainly one more reason heathenry will never, ever be apolitical. But ask yourself, if you are heathen, or any other polytheist religion for that matter that centers around reciprocity, if you view reciprocity with your fellow beings and even the gods as something to strive for, why or how could non-reciprocal economics or governance ever be okay? If you view the gifting cycle as a good way to ensure reciprocity in your own life, why not build socio-economic structures around the same principle? Fuck, the science is there. Pagans, especially heathens, on the right, the far right, folkists and the like, will not be silent about their politics, at least not all of them. To obliterate their co-opting, we on the left have a duty not to be silent about ours. And we need those of you who are not pagan, but are on the left by our side fighting for equality with us. We can do it together. It's something we can reciprocate. With that, as always, knock 'em out.